Daddy, she's hungry. Can we buy it for her? The billionaire CEO's answer shattered the single mom. Before we begin, comment below and tell us, where are you watching from? Which city or town? And when it's over, be sure to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. A billionaire CEO was just picking up cereal with his son, but across the aisle, a little red-headed girl quietly clutched a unicorn cereal box, her hands trembling, her cheeks stained with silent tears. Her mother was too broke to buy it, and when the CEO's son tugged on his suit and asked, "Daddy, she's hungry. Can we buy it for her?" Something broke open in that man's chest. Not just generosity, something deeper. He had no idea that this child's cry would unlock a second chance for a woman who had lost everything, and a man who thought he'd never feel anything again. Aisles of grace. The air inside the Boston supermarket wasn't filled with the scent of fresh bread or produce. It was filled with exhaustion, buzzing fluorescent lights, the sharp clatter of carts with one squeaky wheel, and somewhere underneath it all, the tired breathing of people who were just trying to get by. Frederick Pittenger didn't belong here. Not really. He moved through the aisles in a suit that cost more than most people's weekly wages. Italian shoes clicking against the ceramic floor. A CEO with a face made for Forbes and a heart still bruised by grief. His son, Anthony, just 4 years old, swung his tiny legs from the cart and pointed excitedly at a cereal box. "Daddy, look, this astronaut's going to the moon." Frederick managed to smile. The kind you give when you're trying, but your soul's still wrapped in mourning. Clara, his wife, Anthony's mother, had been gone for 2 years, and in those 2 years, he'd built a fortress around his pain. Work, silence, routine. Until that moment, until one aisle over, a girl with tangled red curls began to cry. Not loudly, not for attention, but the kind of crying that breaks your heart because it tries not to be heard. A few feet away, Elizabeth Groom, 29, knelt beside a cart that held more coupons than groceries. Her hands gripped a crumpled flyer, trying to stretch pennies into meals. Her daughter, Esther, also 4, held a box of glittery unicorn cereal, its bright promise clashing painfully with their grim reality. "Not today, my love," Elizabeth whispered, her voice steady but tired. "We'll get the dinosaur one. It's stronger, so you'll grow big." Esther nodded, but her face fell as Elizabeth turned to grab a bag of rice from the bottom shelf. The squeaky cart beside her moved, blocking her view, and in a flash, Esther was gone. Her heart seized, her breath caught, until she spotted her daughter a few feet away, arms wrapped around that unicorn cereal box like it was treasure from another life, her small frame trembling, tears streaming silently onto the cardboard, blurring the rainbow. Anthony saw her too. The blonde-haired boy with the kind eyes stopped mid-sentence and slid off the cart. He walked toward her with all the courage of someone who had nothing to lose but everything to give. "Why are you crying?" he asked, voice small but true. Esther sniffled. "I really wanted this cereal, but Mommy says we can't buy it anymore." It was a child's explanation for something bigger. Scarcity, loss, the ache of always being told no. Anthony's eyes filled with tears, not because he understood poverty, but because he understood wanting and not having. He turned to Frederick, tugged the cuff of his tailored sleeve. "Daddy," he whispered, "she's hungry. Can we buy it for her?" The question split the world in two. The suits, the salary, the grief, the walls Frederick had built around his heart. All of it collapsed in one breath. He didn't hesitate. He knelt beside the children right there in the cereal aisle. "Of course we can, champ," he said, voice gentle. He looked up and saw Elizabeth standing still, frozen in a mixture of shame and heartbreak. She moved to speak, to pull her daughter away, to apologize for being seen. But Frederick offered the box not with pity, but with quiet respect. And for the first time in years, something softened in both of them. She reached out. Her fingers brushed his, and somewhere between pride and gratitude, a spark passed. They didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a moment. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. A quiet grace. In the middle of aisle 4, chapter 1. The box on aisle 4. It had been a long time since Elizabeth Groom had been seen, really seen. Not as a struggling widow, or the tired barista, or that redhead with the coupons, but as a woman, a mother, a human being trying. Yet here she was, cheeks burning in aisle 4, her daughter cradling a cereal box like a life preserver, and a stranger, the Frederick Pittenger, offering to buy it for her. The CEO of Pittenger Tech, the man from headlines, he stood there holding that glittering unicorn box with quiet poise. No condescension, no pity in his eyes, just kindness, and it unraveled something in her. "Miss," he said gently, "we'd really like to pay for this." Elizabeth felt the air drain from her lungs. She couldn't breathe past the knot in her throat. Her first instinct was retreat, say no, pull her daughter close, and vanish back into the blur of the world that didn't have room for women like her. "Oh no, please," she murmured, forcing a smile through trembling lips. "I'll manage. I can't accept." Her voice was polite, but her body was rigid with shame. Because the truth was, she couldn't manage. Not really. Not after a year of overdrafts, of saying no to birthdays, of rationing shampoo. But accepting kindness meant admitting just how close to the edge she really was. Then she glanced down at Anthony, his eyes wide, hopeful, searching her face for an answer. At Esther, whose small arms wrapped around that cereal box like it held all her childhood dreams. And Elizabeth's pride cracked just enough. "It's Anthony who wants to do this." "Ma'am," Frederick added softly, "he thinks friendship is already worth more than cereal. Don't you, buddy?" Anthony nodded, blonde curls bouncing, unaware of the way his small gesture was shaking the foundations of Elizabeth's walls. Something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but like a door creaking open for the first time in years. Elizabeth reached out slowly. Her fingers met Frederick's as she accepted the box. Their touch was brief but electric, not romantic, not yet, just human. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time in months she'd said those words and meant them without resentment. She didn't meet his eyes, couldn't. Not yet, but something flickered inside her, a tiny, unfamiliar warmth. Not safety, not love, but the idea that maybe she hadn't been invisible after all. As she turned to walk away, holding Esther's hand in one and the cereal box in the other, she felt the weight of eyes on her back, not the eyes of judgment. Frederick watched her go, Anthony standing beside him. And for the first time since Clara's death, something stirred in him too. Not attraction, but recognition. The ache of a familiar loneliness in someone else's posture. They were strangers, still. One lived in glass towers. One lived in borrowed light. But in that moment, on aisle 4, they had something in common. 2 children, 2 empty hearts, and a cereal box that neither of them would ever forget. It was just a grocery store, just a box of cereal. But sometimes, the smallest gesture is the beginning of everything. Chapter 2, Castle of Blocks. 2 days passed. Just 2. But for Elizabeth, they stretched long and thin like taut wires strung between exhaustion and hope. Her days were a patchwork of shifting cafe shifts, lukewarm coffee, aching feet, and the daily arithmetic of survival. She made Esther's peanut butter sandwiches with counted slices, rewashed the same blouse twice a week, waited for buses that never came on time. And through it all, she kept thinking about that man in the supermarket, the softness in his voice, the way he knelt beside the children, not above them, the warmth that hovered fleeting, but real. She didn't even know his name. The preschool hallways smelled like crayons and Elmer's glue. Bright art paper fluttered on the walls. Elizabeth moved quickly, still flustered from a late shift, heart thudding from the uphill sprint. She reached the classroom door, breathless, and paused. She heard laughter, not just any laugh, Esther's, full and wild, like wind chimes caught in a summer breeze. Elizabeth peeked inside. There, seated on the alphabet rug in the center of the room, were two small figures. Esther's red curls were tangled from a long day of play, and beside her sat a boy with golden hair and star-patterned sneakers. They were building a castle of blocks, laughing every time it toppled, rebuilding it with determination only children knew how to summon. Their heads were close. Their hands moved together like they'd been friends forever. Then she saw him, a tall man, near the back of the room, speaking softly with the teacher. Dark suit, broad shoulders, her stomach dipped. Him, the man from the supermarket, Frederick. Her instinct was to retreat. She wasn't ready. Not for more kind eyes, not for more reminders of what she'd become. But before she could turn, "Mommy," Esther squealed. She jumped up, cereal box energy still in her step, and ran straight into her mother's arms. Frederick turned at the sound. Their eyes met again. This time, it was different. The shame wasn't as sharp. The silence between them held something softer. "Elizabeth," he said, recognizing her without hesitation, and the sound of her name from his lips was disarming. "Frederick," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He smiled, not the polished kind from news articles, but the real one, warm, slightly crooked. What a coincidence. Anthony hasn't stopped talking about Esther. He calls her the cereal girl. Elizabeth let out a breathless laugh. Her first real one in weeks. She's talked about him too. Apparently, they're ruling the block kingdom together. The teacher stepped in, glasses perched on the tip of her nose. "They really are inseparable," she said fondly. "It's rare to see such a natural bond." And as she spoke, Elizabeth and Frederick stood side by side, both watching their children. Small bodies hunched over plastic blocks, building something that, somehow, didn't fall. They didn't realize yet that what their children had started was something greater than play. They were building the very first stone of something their parents hadn't dared dream of again, a new life. Their conversation wandered from school schedules to lunchbox tricks to the heavy topic neither could avoid, loss. Frederick's eyes darkened. "Clara, my wife. She passed 2 years ago. Anthony. He saved me." His voice broke in the middle like a tired violin string. Elizabeth looked down, nodding slowly. "My husband died last year, car accident." She didn't explain the rest. Not yet. But Frederick didn't press. The pain in their eyes was familiar, shared, not compared, not judged, just witnessed. In that moment, they weren't a CEO and a barista, not the wealthy man and the poor woman. They were just two people trying to build something again, even if all they had were the scattered blocks of what had been broken. Their children had already built a castle. Now, unknowingly, they were laying the foundation of something far greater. Chapter 3. The interview. The building looked nothing like her life. Polished glass, chrome finishes, the kind of lobby that echoed with the footsteps of people who were sure of themselves. Elizabeth stood just inside the revolving door, her worn purse clutched to her chest, heart thudding loud enough to hear. She didn't belong here. Not in her scuffed shoes, not in her borrowed blazer, not with the scent of dollar store shampoo still clinging to her hair. But Frederick's words kept echoing. You seem incredibly capable. I think you'd do well here. He hadn't pushed. He hadn't promised. He just believed. And somehow, that was enough. The receptionist smiled politely as Elizabeth gave her name. Her voice cracked on the M's. Groom, as if the title still didn't feel real. A few minutes later, she sat in a waiting room filled with glass walls and panoramic views of Boston skyscrapers, rivers, a whole world she thought she'd left behind when Thomas died. Her hands trembled around her resume. It had taken her 3 hours to rewrite it, 2 coffees, and 1 long cry in the kitchen after Esther fell asleep. Because the truth was, she had once been someone, an executive assistant, sharp, fast, indispensable. Before everything fell apart, the interview wasn't what she expected. The HR manager, a soft-spoken woman named Janice, had kind eyes and an easy laugh. Her questions weren't meant to intimidate. They were windows, invitations, and somewhere between question 4 and question 6, something in Elizabeth clicked. Her spine straightened, her voice steadied, the version of her that had been buried beneath late rent notices and cafe mocha spills. She came back bit by bit. The woman who could juggle 10 calendars, smooth over disasters, and write memos that read like lullabies was still alive. By the end, Janice looked impressed. We'll be in touch very soon, she said, standing. Elizabeth shook her hand and nodded, offering a quiet thank you, though the words felt too small. She turned to leave and caught her reflection in the wall of glass. She looked older, tired, but not defeated. What Elizabeth didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Frederick had already spoken to the hiring team. Not with favoritism, not with force, just a quiet word. Give her a fair chance. She's stronger than she knows. The call came 3 days later. Mrs. Groom, we'd love to offer you the position. Welcome to Pittenger Tech. Elizabeth dropped into the kitchen chair, phone shaking in her hand. Esther stared at her from the doorway, holding a crayon. Mommy, are you crying happy or sad? Elizabeth laughed through her tears. Happy, baby. Very, very happy. Her first day was quiet. She wore her best blouse, did her hair the way she used to. The office was sleek, whiteboards, skylines, espresso machines that whispered, but she stayed grounded, precise, efficient. Let her work speak louder than her past. And soon, it did. She was fast, thoughtful, unshakable in pressure. She went unnoticed by some just another quiet assistant, but not by Frederick. He saw her in meetings. He heard the clarity in her reports. He watched the way her smile slowly returned genuine, not painted on. And every time their eyes met, there was a silent recognition of how far she'd come, of how much further they might go. Elizabeth hadn't asked for a handout. She had been handed an opening, and she walked through it with her head held high. The girl from aisle 4 was now at the heart of his company, and without realizing it, at the edge of his heart, too. Chapter 4, The Storm Named Saraphina. It started with the sound of heels, sharp, certain, clicking across the marble floors of Pittenger Tech. Like a metronome with something to prove, Saraphina Vance arrived on a Tuesday. Her entrance was less an arrival and more a performance hair like a raven's wing, coat like liquid gold, and a smile that didn't belong in boardrooms, but on runways. Elizabeth noticed her immediately. Everyone did. But what made Elizabeth's breath catch wasn't the woman's beauty. It was the way she looked at Frederick, not professionally, not platonically, but like he belonged to her. Saraphina had been Clara's friend. That much became clear during introductions. We go way back, she said, brushing her manicured hand along Frederick's arm as if dusting off memory. Clara always said Freddie needed grounding. I guess I was her attempt at that. Frederick smiled politely, but his body stiffened. Elizabeth noticed, and her stomach twisted. The first days of Saraphina's reign were subtle. She didn't storm through like a villain. She charmed. She lingered. She observed. In meetings, she sat too close. In elevators, her compliments came sugar-coated with something else. She always found reasons to accidentally pass by Frederick's office, always smiled at Elizabeth a beat too long, and then the words started. Not direct. Never direct, just enough to unnerve. One afternoon, at the water cooler, Saraphina stood beside Elizabeth, both of them quiet until Saraphina leaned in. Frederick is lucky to have you here, she said. Voice soft. He's been different since Clara passed, but you know how it is. Grief, it makes people vulnerable, makes them reach for comfort where they can. Elizabeth blinked, unsure how to respond. Saraphina smiled sweetly, took a sip of her designer coffee, and walked away. The next time was in the break room. Elizabeth stood alone, stirring tea when Saraphina appeared again. Clara's illness was so sudden, wasn't it? She mused aloud. No clear cause? Doctors baffled. A tragedy. Strange. Really. She let the silence hang like poison in the air. Elizabeth turned, brow furrowed. What are you trying to say? Saraphina tilted her head. Nothing, darling. Just grief can make people do all sorts of things. Act out of character. She left her words hanging there, like storm clouds just out of reach. Elizabeth didn't sleep that night, not because she believed Saraphina, but because doubt is a slippery thing. It doesn't enter like a storm. It drips quietly, steadily, until everything inside you is damp with suspicion. She hated that it was working, hated that she was even wondering, because Frederick had only shown her kindness, integrity, respect. But what if that wasn't all there was? The children stayed blissfully unaware. Esther still talked about Anthony every night. Anthony still drew pictures of their family rocket ship. And Frederick. He was still Frederick. Still asking how her day was. Still thanking her for her help. Still smiling with that quiet edge of something unspoken. But Elizabeth now watched him with different eyes. Not colder, not cruel, just guarded. One afternoon, Frederick complimented a memo she'd written. Elegant. As always. Elizabeth smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. And Frederick noticed the walls between them hadn't been built by truth, but by whispers, and sometimes. That's all it takes. A storm doesn't always shout. Sometimes. It arrives, dressed in silk and smiles. And her name is Saraphina. Chapter 5. Shadows and Shame. It started with whispers. Again, but this time, they weren't just in her mind. Elizabeth walked into the office one morning and felt it immediately. The quiet that wasn't quiet. The kind that grows in break rooms when people pretend they weren't just talking about you. The first blog post appeared that afternoon. A gossip site, barely credible, but credible enough. Widowed barista, snags CEO, job after supermarket encounter. Pity hire or gold digger. Her name wasn't used, but the details were unmistakable. Single mother, widowed, grocery store moment, employed at Pittenger Tech after emotional plea. She stared at the screen, face pale, pulse roaring in her ears. The screen blurred. Her fingers trembled on the mouse. She closed the tab, but it was too late. The shame had already sunk in. The next article came 2 days later. Worse. A tale of two widows, CEO Pittinger's new flame, and the scandal behind her husband's death. This time, it named her. This time, it dredged up the past she had buried like a body. Thomas, the accident, the drinking, the debts, the headline hinted. The article twisted. Anonymous sources. Convenient timing. A single sentence pierced her. Some say her husband's death was no accident, that she knew, that she left him to crash. Elizabeth felt her legs give beneath her. She barely made it to the office bathroom before the sob burst from her chest. She didn't remember how long she sat there, on the cold tile, hand clamped over her mouth, trying not to make a sound. That night, at home, she stared at the wall, Esther colored beside her on the rug, humming softly, and all Elizabeth could think was, they're going to take this from me. Not just the job, not just the security, but the peace, the dignity, the little shard of self-worth she had finally found again. She avoided Frederick the next day, didn't knock on his door, didn't meet his eyes in meetings, didn't smile. He noticed. Then came the final blow. A full spread this time in a mid-tier tabloid. A photo of Frederick, Elizabeth, and the kids in Beacon Hill Park, smiling, eating ice cream. The caption, behind the perfect picture, tragedy or transaction. Clara's death, never explained. Did Frederick replace her? Too quickly. Frederick's rage was immediate. He stood in his office, fists clenched, the paper trembling in his hand. Clara's name desecrated. His son dragged into gossip. Elizabeth vilified. He called his head of security. Find out who did this. Now. I want names. I want IPs. I want it traced. But in his voice wasn't just fury. It was betrayal. Because he had a suspicion. A strong one. One name that fit every thread. Saraphina. Meanwhile, Elizabeth sat at her desk, staring blankly at a spreadsheet. The numbers meant nothing. Her inbox blinked. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen. She could feel them watching again. The same stares she got after Thomas died. Not compassion, not concern, just judgment. She wiped a tear before it fell, held her head high, typed the next number. That night, after Esther had fallen asleep, with her favorite storybook tucked beneath her arm, Elizabeth sat on the floor of their apartment. She didn't cry. She was too tired, too familiar with humiliation, too used to surviving it. But she whispered into the dark, please don't let this be taken away from us. Some wounds don't bleed. They burn. They hum beneath the skin. And when shame returns wearing a new face, it doesn't knock. It moves in, uninvited, unforgiving. But in the dark, a light was still coming, and it would arrive with fire. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The sun was low over Boston, casting long shadows across the glass walls of Pittenger Tech. Inside Frederick's office, everything was still except for the tight clench of his jaw and the faint hum of his security chief on speaker. It's confirmed, sir. The leaks came from Saraphina Vance's login. 3 separate instances. Files accessed after hours. IP address traced to an ad agency she's linked to. All circumstantial, but stacked. It's damning. Frederick closed his eyes. He'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. He looked down at the article again. Clara's name, twisted. Elizabeth's life, shredded. Anthony's face, in the frame. He didn't feel rage. Not yet. Just a deep, guttural sorrow. Tell her I want her in my office. Now. And bring Elizabeth, too. 10 minutes later, Saraphina walked in like she owned the floor. Silk blouse, confident smirk. A woman used to dancing at the edge of power. Elizabeth followed a step behind, unsure why she was there, until she saw Saraphina. Her stomach dropped. The air between them snapped tight like a drawn bowstring. Frederick, Saraphina purred. To what do I owe this dramatic summons? He didn't rise, didn't smile. Sit. She blinked. So did Elizabeth. Frederick slid the printout of the tabloid across the desk. Let's talk about this, Saraphina scoffed. Lightly. Oh, come on. You think I don't think, Frederick interrupted. I know. His voice was colder than Elizabeth had ever heard it. Steady. Lethal. You accessed private HR files. You leaked details to third-party blogs. You fed anonymous quotes to gossip sites. You tried to destroy a woman's life. and dragged my wife's memory through the mud to do it. Seraphina's smile faltered. That's absurd. Is it? He pressed a button on his desk. An audio clip began to play. Seraphina's voice. A call, caught on a monitored line. It'll stir just enough scandal to make her back off. He'll see it eventually. They all do. The silence after the recording ended was thick and brutal. Elizabeth's mouth was dry. Seraphina's face went pale. You bugged my calls, she whispered. Voice breaking. This is my company, Frederick said. I protect what matters. He looked over at Elizabeth, just briefly, and she matters. Seraphina stood, jaw clenched, eyes wild. I did it for you. I did it because I love you. Frederick, Clara's gone, and you were mine before she ever. No. He rose to his feet, tall, quiet, unmoving. I was never yours. She looked at Elizabeth now, with pure, bitter hatred. You don't belong here, she hissed. You with your thrift store, shoes, and sob story. You think he loves you? You're just a replacement for the wife. He can't stop mourning. Elizabeth flinched, then stood up straight. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to, because Frederick had already moved to her side. You're fired. Saraphina, he said, voice like iron. And if I ever see another article tied to your name, I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. Security entered. Saraphina didn't cry. She screamed. But no one listened. They escorted her out, heels echoing like thunder on the marble floor. The door closed. Elizabeth stood frozen, the aftershock of the confrontation still settling in her bones. Frederick turned to her. His voice gentled. I'm sorry. She shook her head slowly, throat thick. You didn't write the articles. No, but I let doubt linger. I should have seen it sooner. I let someone hurt you under my roof. Elizabeth exhaled shakily. You stopped it. That's what matters. They stood in silence for a long moment. No boardroom, no scandal. Just two people in the eye of a storm, finally seeing each other clearly. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. The reckoning hadn't been public. No press release, no victory speech. But it was real. It was enough. The storm had passed, and in its quiet wake, trust had survived. Chapter 7. Dinner for 4. The apartment was small, not in the way that begged apology, but in the way that held warmth in every corner. Elizabeth had cleaned it 3 times, then once more, just to make sure. The chipped dining table was covered with her best tablecloth, sun-faded but soft. 2 mismatched candles flickered beside the casserole dish, their dollar store scent sweet and comforting. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers, and tonight, it mattered. Esther had asked the question that started it all. Mommy, can Anthony come to dinner? And his daddy, too. He's funny. Elizabeth's first instinct had been panic. Anvar. Invite Frederick Pittenger, CEO of a tech empire, into this little 2-bedroom apartment. But when she'd asked, he said yes, not out of obligation, not out of politeness, but with a warmth that felt genuine. I'd love to. Now, he stood in her doorway, holding a bottle of wine and looking oddly out of place and completely at ease. Anthony darted past him, already shouting Esther, "Where are you?" Their laughter filled the hallway before they'd even taken off their coats. Elizabeth greeted Frederick with a nervous smile. He noticed the effort, the candles, the scent of something homemade, the way she smoothed her hair. This smells incredible, he said, stepping inside. I warned Anthony not to ask for seconds too early. Elizabeth laughed, softer now. Dinner was simple. Chicken stew, warm bread, juice for the kids, wine for the grown-ups. The children talked so much they barely ate, giggling through spoonfuls and kicking each other under the table. Frederick complimented the meal. Twice. This is better than anything I've had at those uptight business dinners. I mean it. Elizabeth blushed. It's my mother's recipe. It doesn't look like much, but it comforts. After dinner, the kids dragged books into the living room. They flopped onto pillows, creating a chaotic pile of blankets, crayons, and giggles. Frederick and Elizabeth sat side by side on the small couch. There was no music playing, just the quiet hum of domestic joy and the sound of two hearts letting down their guard. He turned to her. "Thank you for tonight. It means more than I can say." She smiled. "You're not used to being invited into homes like this, are you?" He shook his head. "Not since Clara." His voice caught, but he didn't retreat from it. She hated big parties, loved cheap pizza, and movie nights with Anthony. This reminds me of her, not in a sad way, in a full circle kind of way. Elizabeth exhaled slowly. She'd been holding this moment, this opening for days. And now, beside the man who had shown her dignity in aisle 4, she let it fall. "My husband, Thomas." He was a musician, brilliant, but troubled. He drank. She paused, the truth still a heavy thing in her mouth. "He crashed, drunk. I lost him, and I lost everything else after that. Friends, reputation, credit. I became a scandal, a single mother trying to disappear." She looked at her lap. Frederick reached over gently, his hand resting over hers. "You didn't disappear." He said it like a vow. "You survived, and you rebuilt." "I see that." Esther sees that. Her eyes met his. Tears didn't fall, but something settled in her chest. Relief, recognition, respect. They didn't kiss, not yet, but the silence between them changed. It wasn't shy anymore. It was safe. The kids eventually fell asleep in a blanket fort. Anthony snored. Esther drooled on her favorite plushie. Frederick helped Elizabeth tuck them into bed, lifting Anthony with practiced ease. Then, by the door, he turned one last time. "Can I see you again?" Elizabeth nodded. "Yes, but next time, maybe I bring dinner." He grinned. "Deal. Just don't outcook me." Sometimes, love doesn't enter with fireworks. It arrives in small bowls of stew, in laughter, in safety, in the quiet recognition of someone who sees all your scars and stays anyway. Chapter 8. Iwan Memsi. Blanket beneath the sky. The grass was thick beneath the blanket, warm from the sun. Beacon Hill Park shimmered in late spring light leaves rustling above. Cotton clouds drifting lazily across a sky so blue it didn't seem real. Anthony and Esther were already running, barefoot and wild. Her red curls bounced like firelight. His straw-colored hair flared beneath his sun hat as they darted between trees and laughter. It was the kind of day that asked nothing of anyone except to be present. Elizabeth lay back on the checkered blanket, the city skyline far in the distance, her sandals off, the hem of her cotton dress tugged by the breeze. Beside her, Frederick sat cross-legged, sleeves rolled, sunglasses perched in his hair, watching the children with quiet awe. "They look like they've known each other forever," he murmured. Elizabeth turned to him, smile soft. "Some people just find each other, no matter how small they are." He nodded. "It's like they remember something we don't." The kids had turned a fallen branch into a rocket ship. Esther was the captain. Anthony was the moon inspector. And the blanket was mission control. "Watch out for space dinosaurs," Esther cried, ducking behind a tree. "Captain Esther to rescue," Anthony shouted, chasing her with wild, open laughter. Their joy was so pure, it almost hurt to watch. Elizabeth exhaled deeply. "I never imagined she'd be this happy again." Frederick turned to her. "That's because of you." She looked down. But he wasn't done. And because of Anthony, and maybe because something good is happening here. He didn't say between us. He didn't have to. It was in the space between their bodies on the blanket, in the way their fingers nearly touched, but didn't yet, in the way their breaths synced without trying. Elizabeth reached for the thermos and poured iced tea into 2 plastic cups. Frederick took his with a quiet smile. They sat like that for a long time, not filling the air, not afraid of silence. Because silence with the right person doesn't feel empty, it feels safe. As the sun began to dip lower, casting golden light across the trees, the children returned red-cheeked, grass-stained, breathless. They curled into the blanket beside their parents, the game forgotten, their small bodies radiating heat and trust. Anthony rested his head on Elizabeth's lap. Esther leaned against Frederick's arm, her thumb in her mouth. Elizabeth met Frederick's eyes across the small, shared universe between them. "What do we do with this?" she asked, her voice low. "This thing we're building." Frederick didn't look away. "We don't rush it, but we don't run from it either." He placed his hand slowly over hers, palm to palm, warm and steady. "We let it become whatever it's meant to," and there it was. Not a declaration, not a promise, but a recognition that something was blooming. Not forced, not planned, just alive. There are moments in life that don't ask you to leap, only to stay, to sit on a blanket beneath the sky, and choose to keep showing up for something beautiful you never thought you'd have again. Chapter 9. The ring in the cereal box. The sun was sinking, painting the park in a wash of peach and gold. Children's laughter faded into tired sighs. Ducks paddled quietly in the pond nearby, and on a blanket under the wide-open sky, 4 souls lingered, not quite ready for the moment to end. Anthony sat with his legs crossed, cheeks still flushed from play. Esther leaned against Elizabeth's arm, twirling a blade of grass in her fingers. Then, with a conspiratorial grin, Anthony whispered something into Esther's ear. She gasped, nodded, and ran to Frederick's satchel, pulling something out like it was treasure. It was a brand new box of Magic Unicorn cereal, unopened, bright, sparkling, just like the one from aisle 4. Elizabeth blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "You brought this?" she asked softly, looking up at Frederick. He smiled, nodded. Anthony cleared his throat dramatically. "Daddy and I have something to say." He turned to Esther. "You go first." Esther stood, hands on her hips, voice clear and proud. This cereal made Mommy sad, and then happy, and then she looked at Anthony. "Then we got a family." Anthony grinned. He reached into the box and pulled something out. Not cereal, not a toy, a blue velvet ring box. Elizabeth froze. The world shrank to a pinpoint. Her fingers curled into the edge of the blanket as Frederick took the box, stood, and knelt beside her. Her breath hitched. She hadn't expected this. Not today. Not ever. "Elizabeth," Frederick began, voice low and steady, his hand trembling just slightly. "The day Anthony asked me to buy that cereal, I thought I was just giving a child a treat, but I didn't know I was stepping into something that would change my life." He opened the box. A diamond glinted simple, elegant, full of light. "You weren't part of my plan." He smiled faintly. "But you became my peace, my beginning again. You brought laughter back into our home, hope back into our mornings, and love back into my heart." He reached for her hand. "I don't just want you to be mine. I want to be yours, yours and Esther's. If you'll let me, Elizabeth Groom, will you marry me?" Elizabeth didn't speak, couldn't. Tears filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. She looked at Esther, grinning, hopeful, then at Anthony, who mouthed, "Say yes," like it was obvious, and then, finally, at Frederick. His eyes held nothing but love, not pity, not rescue. Love, real, earned, rooted in everything they'd survived. She nodded, hand covering her mouth, then found her voice. "Yes, yes, Frederick. Of course, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger. It sparkled, not because of the diamond, but because of what it meant. Home, healing, a story rewritten. The children threw themselves into their arms, a pile of arms, joy, and cereal crumbs. The park around them faded, the skyline blurred. Only this moment existed now. What started as an act of kindness in a grocery aisle ended with a promise beneath the sky that even the most broken stories can still find their way to yes. Chapter 10. Home, at last. The house had always been silent, even with the best design, even with art on the walls and light in every room. It had never felt like home, not after Clara. Until now, the halls echoed with small footsteps. Laughter spilled from rooms once hushed by grief. Pillows were never where they were supposed to be, and the smell of cinnamon toast drifted up the staircase each morning. Elizabeth stood at the kitchen counter, barefoot, her engagement ring catching the morning sun. Esther sat on a stool, drawing pictures of planets and cereal boxes, humming softly. Frederick walked in with messy hair and a mug that read, "Best Dad," unofficially. Anthony was already in the living room, building a rocket ship out of couch cushions. This wasn't a fairy tale. No one had been rescued. They'd saved themselves piece by piece. But what had changed was everything. The wedding would come later, a small one. Backyard, flowers picked by hand, but they didn't need vows yet to live like a family. They shared lunch boxes, shared pickup schedules, shared Sunday grocery trips, Elizabeth pushing the cart, Frederick sneaking extra cereal into it when Esther wasn't looking. One evening, they framed the empty cereal box, the original one, the one Esther had once clung to with tears in her eyes. It sat on a shelf in the living room, next to photos of both families. Clara's smile preserved in a frame, Thomas's guitar picks in a small jar beside it, not erased, just honored. That night, after the kids had fallen asleep, Elizabeth curled against Frederick on the couch. The fire was low. Rain tapped against the windows. She looked up at him, her voice a whisper. "Do you think it's okay to be this happy again?" Frederick kissed her forehead gently. "I think it's exactly what they'd want for us. Clara, Thomas, I think they'd be proud we didn't stop living." She closed her eyes. "I still have hard days. So do I." He held her hand. "But now, we have soft days too." The door creaked. Anthony stood there in pajamas, holding his blanket. "I can't sleep." Esther padded in behind him. "I had a dream about the cereal again." Frederick smiled. "Come on." Then, group snuggle. They all piled onto the couch, one big tangle of limbs and blankets and sleepy heads. Frederick with a child under each arm, Elizabeth resting her head on his chest. Love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it comes on a Tuesday night with a tired child in your arms and a partner who understands your silence. They had lived through grief. They had endured shame. But now they had each other. They had peace. They had home. At last, the real riches. The world didn't stop for their love. Bills still came. Dishes still piled. The children still got fevers on inconvenient nights. But something in their world had changed forever. Elizabeth, once invisible, now walked through each day with her chin lifted and her heart open. Frederick, once surrounded by glass walls and polite distance, now came home to fingerprints on the windows and laughter in the hallway. There was no fairy tale ending, but there was something better, a real one, because real love doesn't rescue you. It walks beside you. It listens. It stays. On the shelf in the living room sat a glass frame. Inside it, a single box of cereal, bright, wrinkled, a little faded from the sun. It wasn't there because it was valuable. It was there because it reminded them how everything started, not with grand gestures, but with kindness and a child's simple question. "Daddy, she's hungry. Can we buy it for her?" That question had opened the door to everything, to dignity, to healing, to a home where silence wasn't heavy, just peaceful, to a love that saw scars and stayed anyway. We want to hear from you. What part of this story touched you the most? Have you ever experienced kindness when you needed it most? Tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? And how would you rate this story from 0 to 10? And don't forget, if you loved this true love story, be sure to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. Click here to watch more now